So the last time, prepared 100 kilograms of feed using conventional ingredients such as maize, soya beans, fish meal, and then we added some wheat bran to it. Now we realized that after calculating the cost of 100 kilograms of the feed to prepare, the price was quite high. So we decided that we're going to make feed using alternative and cheaper ingredients. Now, this is what we are going to do. We are going to prepare the feed without compromising the nutritional quality of our feed. So even though we are going to bring in alternative cheaper ingredients like PKC, spent grain, cassava meal, groundnut cake, blood meal, and then bone meal, we are not going to sacrifice the quality of our feed. The crude protein content should be met. It shouldn't exceed that and it shouldn't be below it. The crude fiber content should be there. It shouldn't go above or below it. And we are going to do it for all the stages of the pigs. In order for us to do a proper substitution that will maintain the nutritional quality or the nutritional content of our feed, we have to know what are these conventional ingredients and why are they the most widely used ingredient in making pig feed. And then we'll move on to look at the alternative cheaper ingredients and their nutritional content. We'll also look at the problems or some of the measures you should put in place if you are to use these alternative feed ingredients. And then from there, we'll look at how to substitute. So what are the conventional ingredients and why are they the most widely used ingredients in pig feed preparation? So these two ingredients, maize and soya beans, are the most staple and the most conventional ingredients used in pig feed preparation. So that is why we have the popular 3 ingredients diet. That's a diet made of maize, soya beans, and then premix. So you know that maize will be the source of carbohydrates or energy, also providing some amount of fiber. Then soya beans is the source of protein in that feed, and then the premix that's added is going to give the minerals and then the vitamins. So if you look at these 3 ingredients diet, it has all the requirements for a standard pig's diet. Because both humans and then animals were eating maize and soya beans, it got to a point where we had to substitute some amount of the soya beans with fish meal. And then studies showed that fish meal was an excellent source of protein and also offers high amounts of amino acids. And further studies showed that the fiber that maize and then soya beans was offering was not enough, and that adding a fiber source will help to improve the gut health of the pigs. It will help the pig digest feed better and convert feed better. So then came the addition of a fiber source like maize bran, wheat bran, and then rice bran. So then from there we had our 5 ingredient diet. That is maize, soya beans, wheat bran, fish meal, and premix. So these 5 ingredients will offer you all the nutritional requirements that your pig needs. So if not for the prices of the feed ingredients and then the fact that sometimes these ingredients go scarce, no one would have been thinking of replacing these ingredients with other ingredients. So note that the main reason for replacing or substituting the conventional ingredients with other ingredients is because of the price and scarcity of these ingredients. And as such, the ingredients that we want to replace them with should provide at least a similar amount of nutrients that these ingredients offer. So then let me put it here. This is the nutritional content of our conventional or our staple ingredients: the crude protein content, the crude fiber content, the crude energy content of our feed. And so our replacement ingredients, we are also going to look at their nutritional content and see how we can successfully put them into our feed without downgrading the quality of our feed. So our alternative feed ingredients are ingredients that are much cheaper and can be able to meet the nutritional requirements of our pigs. So let's look at the alternative feed ingredients. So to replace maize, which is our carbohydrate or energy source, we have cassava meal, And to replace fish meal and soya beans as our protein source, we have groundnut cake, blood meal, and then bone meal. And then to replace wheat bran, rice bran, or maize bran as our fiber source, we have PKC and spent grains. So let's look at the crude protein content, the crude fiber content, and the crude energy content of our alternative ingredients. So let's make it into a table. So these values are experimental values that have been generated over time. And so I'm going to give you these values. So for cassava meal, it has a crude protein content of 2 to 4%, which is an average of about 3%, and a crude fiber content of 5%. And for PKC, it has a crude protein content of about 14 to 18%, which is an average of about 16%, and a crude fiber content ranging between 12 to 20%, averaging 16%, and an energy content of about 3000 kilocalories. And for the brewer's spent grains, it has a crude protein content of about 14 to 30%, giving me an average of 22%, and then a crude fiber content of 15 to 26%, giving an average of 21%. And its energy content ranges between 3600 to 3500. So you can see that the energy content for the spent grains, the range is high because it depends on the grains that were used by the factory that you got your spent grains from. So now let's look at groundnut cake. The crude protein content of groundnut cake is about 45%, and its crude fiber ranges between 3.8 to 7.5%, giving an average of 5.7%, and its crude energy content is about 2500 to 2900 kilocalories. Now let's look at blood meal. The crude protein content of blood meal gives an average of about 80% and a crude fiber content of about 1% or even less. And then let's look at bone meal. Bone meal has a crude protein content of about 50% and a crude fiber content that is less than 3%. On an average, is about 2%. So we cannot just substitute anyhow. We cannot just take maize out and put PKC in. We cannot just take anything out and put other ingredients in, because these replacement ingredients that are much cheaper also come with certain, should I say, problems or certain downsides that we have to look at so that we can be able to do a proper replacement. You cannot just put any amount of these ingredients into the feed, else you will downgrade the nutritional content of your feed. So how do we substitute properly? What are some of the things that we have to look at before we take out our conventional ingredient and put in our replacement or cheaper ingredient? So to do that, it means you have to compare the ingredients. So if you take the carbohydrate given ingredient, let's take our staple ingredient, which is maize, and compare it with our replacement ingredient, which is cassava meal. Let's look at the energy content of these two ingredients. Both maize and cassava meal have a similar energy content. So you have no issue with the energy content. Now let's look at the crude protein content. Cassava meal has a lower crude protein content, which is 5%, compared to maize, which has a crude protein content of 8.23%. Now let's look at their fiber content. Even though they have similar crude fiber content, cassava meal has a higher crude fiber content, averaging about 5%, compared to maize, which has a crude fiber content of about 2.2%. Now let's compare their amino acid content. Cassava meal has lower levels of the essential amino acids like lysine and methionine compared to maize. So even though maize also has a low lysine and methionine content, its amino acid content, when compared to cassava meal, it is much richer in these amino acids. So based on the comparisons that we've done between cassava meal and maize, now what will be the effect on your feed if you directly replace maize with cassava meal? Let's say you have 50 kilograms of maize and then you just take it all out and put 50 kilograms of cassava meal. What will be the implication of your feed? It means that the protein content of your feed will be lowered, the amino acid content of your feed will be lowered, and then the crude fiber content of your feed will go up, but your energy content will remain almost the same. Now, this is the problem here. Sometimes there's scarcity of maize, and then sometimes the price of maize is high. We want to replace maize with cassava meal. What do we do? You can do a 50% substitution. You take out 50% of your maize and replace it with cassava meal. Now, this 50% value is lower for the starters, and then it comes up for the growers, and then goes up again for the finisher feed. So in starter feed, we want more proteins, right? So we don't want to lower the protein content of our feed. You can do a 30 to 35 substitution. And then for growers, you can do a 35 to 40% substitution. And then for finisher feed, you can do a 40% to 50% substitution of maize with cassava meal. Now, after replacing maize with cassava meal, the next thing to do is to also increase the protein content of your feed. So if you are using about 15 kilograms of soya beans, now you have to increase it, maybe add about 3%, or you can add a different source of protein. You can add fish meal, or you can add blood meal, or you can add bone meal, just so that you are able to raise the protein content of your feed back to normal levels. And then you have to add some amino acids to your feed. You have to add some lysine and some methionine to your feed. So that is all for the replacement on the carbohydrate or energy giving feeds. So now let's look at these two ingredients, bone meal and blood meal. They are protein sources, but now I call them top up proteins because they cannot replace the proteins in our feed. However, they can increase the protein content of our feed because they are high in proteins. Bone meal has a protein content of 50%, whilst blood meal has a protein content of 80%. So now let's look at bone meal alone. Bone meal has a medium energy content. It has a high crude fiber content of 50%. It has a low crude fiber content of about 2%. And then it has some amino acids, but the amino acid composition of bone meal is very imbalanced. Bone meal also has good amounts of calcium and phosphorus, which is a very good addition. So in that case, when you use bone meal, there's no need to add dicalcium phosphate to your feed. So basically, bone meal is added to improve the protein content of your feed and also serves as a source of calcium and phosphorus for the feed. Now let's look at the cautions on bone meal. These are some things that you have to note when you want to include bone meal in your feed. Do not use excess amount of bone meal just because you want to increase the protein content of your feed or increase the calcium and phosphorus levels. An excess of bone meal will make your feed unpalatable. It is not so nice. So adding too much of it will make your pigs not eat the feed very well because it doesn't taste nice. Also, excess amount of bone meal can lead to problems with digestion because the proteins in bone meal are not easily digestible. And also in turn, it will affect the digestibility of other proteins and amino acids that are in your feed. So that would be a huge problem. And another thing is that bone meal may contain harmful bacteria if not treated properly. So you have to ensure that the bone meal that you are sourcing is from a trusted place that produces quality bone meal. So now how do we substitute or add bone meal to our feed? Let's look at that. Add a maximum of 3 to 5% of bone meal in your feed. Don't exceed this amount. Don't exceed this amount. If you add more than 3 to 5% of bone meal to your feed, you are shooting up the calcium and phosphorus levels in your feed. And this will lead to problems. So don't add too much. At least 2% is okay, 3% is okay, 4% is okay. Don't exceed 5%, please. Also, remember that once you add bone meal to your feed, there's no need to add dicalcium phosphate because you have calcium and phosphate already from your bone meal. Now let's look at blood meal. Blood meal has a medium energy content, meaning that it's not so low and it is not so high in energy. Blood meal has a high crude protein content of about 80% and it has a low crude fiber content of about 1%. So for the amino acid content of blood meal, it has a high amount of lysine but low amount of methionine. Now let's look at some cautions on blood meal. Bone meal and blood meal, you have to add them with caution. Once you add blood meal, you've created an imbalance of amino acids. So you have to balance that out because blood meal will shoot the lysine content of your feed up, but then the methionine content will be low. So you have to balance it out if you use blood meal. And then also you have to make sure that the blood meal that you are using is from a trusted source and it has been treated well. Make sure that you don't add blood meal to your feed and let it sit for a long while, else it will go bad. So only add blood meal when you are ready to serve. You can use it to prepare the feed and say serve it within 3 days. Don't let it exceed going to a week, else it will go bad. Now, just like bone meal, blood meal is also not palatable. It will make your pigs not enjoy the feed, so they'll not eat much. That is why you don't have to add excess. Once you add excess, they wouldn't eat much. So use a small amount, about 3 to 5%. That will not affect the taste of the feed, and then your pigs can eat much. So blood meal and bone meal are basically to increase the protein content of your feed, especially when you use other ingredients that are low in protein. So you add the blood meal, then it raises the protein content of your feed. So blood and bone meal are not replacement ingredients. They cannot substitute any ingredient. They are on their own. We just add a small amount because I said 3 to 5%. So just imagine replacing soya beans with blood meal or bone meal. That means you're going to add about 15 or 20%. And with that, you have completely destroyed the nutritional profile of your feed. So I'm hitting on this so much. Blood meal and bone meal are not replacement or substitution ingredients. They cannot replace any ingredient. They only boost the protein content of your feed that you've prepared. So let's look at groundnut cake. Groundnut cake is a source of protein and it can replace some amount of soya beans and fish meal. So now let's compare their nutritional content. Groundnut cake has a similar energy content as soya beans and fish meal, and it also has a similar crude protein content as soya beans and fish meal, even though that of fish meal is a little bit higher. Groundnut cake has a higher fiber content of about 3.8 to 7.5% compared to soya beans, which has a fiber content of 3.5%, and fish meal, which has a fiber content of 1%. Now, looking at the amino acid content, groundnut cake is poor in amino acids, that is lysine and methionine, compared to fish meal and soya beans. Now, groundnut cake has an additional benefit. It is very palatable and it can increase the feed intake by your pigs. Now, these are some cautions that you have to take when using groundnut cake. Groundnut cake is prone to contamination by fungi, especially during its storage. If you don't store it properly, it can easily grow fungi. The fungal contamination is very toxic. So this is where toxin binder comes in. The toxin binder is able to bind these toxins into one and then prevent it from being absorbed into the body of the pig, where it will cause problems. Now, groundnut cake also contains some inhibitors and they can slow down the activity of enzymes because enzymes are the ones that break down the feed and then release the protein that the pig needs from the feed. So these inhibitors do not make the enzymes work very well. So when you add groundnut cake to your feed, be sure to also add some enzymes that will help break down the proteins for uptake by the pigs. Now, how do we do a proper substitution? Groundnut cake can only replace a portion of soya beans and fish meal, up to 20% replacement, up to 20%. So that means that, let's say if you have 25 kilograms of soya beans in your feed, groundnut cake can replace 20% of that 25 kilograms, which will be 5 kilograms. So you can use 20 kilograms of the soya beans and 5 kilograms of your groundnut cake and you'll be okay. Now, adding groundnut cake to the feed will also reduce the lysine content of the feed. So it's either you have fish meal there that will be able to cater for the reduction in the lysine content, or you add some amount of lysine to the feed to be able to raise up the lysine content of the feed back to normal. Now let's look at the ingredients that we classified as the fiber ingredients, and that is PKC and Brewers spent grains. So PKC and Brewers spent grains are very similar. They both have medium energy content, medium protein content, and a high fiber content. And they can replace some amount of maize, some amount of soya beans, and can fully replace wheat bran. Now for the amino acid content, both PKC and Brewer's spent grains have low amount of lysine and low amount of methionine. Now this is the caution that you have to take when you are using PKC and Brewer's spent grains. These ingredients are prone to contamination by fungi, especially during their storage. If they are not stored properly, they can easily be contaminated by fungi activity, and this will release toxic substances into your feed, which is not good for your pigs. Now, the effects of these toxic substances can be reduced by adding toxin binder to your feed. So the toxin binder will bind the toxic substances and prevents them from being absorbed into the body of the pig. Now also both PKC and spent grains have high amounts of fiber, and most of these fibers are insoluble, meaning that it is difficult for the pigs to digest, because you know pigs are monogastric animals. So it is already hard for them to digest fiber. Unlike in ruminants that have the four chambers, they're able to digest PKC and brewer spent grains better than our pigs. So what do? We have to add enzymes to the feed. Now the enzymes will help to improve digestion and help to release the nutrients from the feed for the pigs to be able to absorb, and then it will lead to their growth. Now let's look at what an excess of PKC in your feed can do. Using too much PKC in your feed can lead to a decrease in the feed conversion rate. This means that your pig will have to eat more kilograms per day in order to meet their protein and then their energy requirements, which are necessary for their growth. So if you use too much PKC and it makes the diet very bulky and your pigs are not able to consume very much, know that your pigs will begin to lose weight, because too much fiber will make your feed also bulky, and now the pigs need more amount of it, but they are not able to consume more because when they eat to a point they feel full because of the high fiber. Now to prevent the digestion problems that comes with using PKC and brewer spent grain in the feed, you have to substitute properly. Now let me clear this first. So you already know that in crib feed you don't add any fiber. So that means that PKC and brewer spent grain are cancelled from crib feed already. Because even with bran, we don't use it in crib feed. So don't use PKC or brewer spent grain in crib feed. So in the starter stage, the maximum amount of PKC and brewer spent grain that you can use is 10%. So I would recommend that in the early starter stage, when the pig is about 4 to 6 weeks, still don't add any PKC or brewer spent grain. But from about 7 weeks onwards, then you can add the 10% of PKC or brewer spent grain to your feed. For the grower stage, you can add a maximum of 15% of PKC or brewer spent grain to your feed. And at the finisher stage, add a maximum of 20% of PKC or brewer spent grain to the feed. Now, I see people go beyond sometimes 30%. Doing that, when you try balancing out your crude fiber, crude protein, you realize that your crude fiber percentage is very high. And that means that when your pig eats that feed, it will pass out most of the fiber undigested, meaning that it's going to waste the feed because it doesn't need that amount of fiber and it will not digest it. So it will pass it out as waste. It will not be of any benefit to the pig. So if you want maximum growth for your pigs and your pig to be able to use all the nutrients in the feed that you give them, do not exceed these maximum values of PKC and spent grain that I have given you. It's a bye for now, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.